week, which was the Supreme Court, for the time being, putting on pause Trump's ability to deport Venezuelans who are currently in detention at the Texas, I think it's Allen, Texas facility, in a one paragraph. Now that I mentioned that, though I haven't read the dissent from Thomas, the news sort of makes it out to be like some big defeat. When I look at it, to me, I'm just hoping the Supreme Court says, okay, we'll just pause it now and make everybody happy until we come down with our ruling, which is going to be to obviously ratify Trump's ability to carry out acts in virtue of the Alien Enemies Act, which he's within his full presidential authority to invoke, and to designate people as terrorists. And people saying due process, that's what you do when you invoke the Alien Emergencies Act, and say, this is a predatory incursion from people we've designated as terrorists. They don't get the full due process. This is something of a quasi-war tactic that the courts don't get to determine. People were freaking out all week. The bottom line, let's even go back to Kilmar Abrego Garcia. I keep putting out the evidence that he was designated by the court as an MS-13 gang member. In the photo of him with Van Hollen the other day, when Van Hollen traveled to El Salvador to look in on, in an interview, he almost called him an American, to look in to the situation of the El Salvadorian who was deported to El Salvador and is now in detention in El Salvador, presumably because he's an MS-13 gang member. He had figure tats. It was a marijuana smiley face, and then what looks like the numbers 1 and 3, and that is by and large because he's a member of the MS-13. The question that I had was, is there any legitimate question as to his designated status as an MS-13 gang member?
They've tried to dispute it, but the evidence is rather overwhelming against him. When he's had the opportunity to contest it in immigration proceedings, he's been unsuccessful. Every immigration proceeding that has adjudicated the question, in which he had the opportunity to present evidence, cross-examine accusers, etc., has concluded that he is, in fact, an MS-13 member. If you just knew who was largely coming in from El Salvador in the time frame he originally came into the country, a lot of them had ties to MS-13, one way, shape, or form. Then you know that he's been, it was a Prince George's County police report, which, by the way, if you don't know, Prince George's County is one of the most liberal Democratic counties in the country. It was that county that concluded in its police report that he was an MS-13 member. Because of when he was arrested. He was arrested wearing MS-13 paraphernalia. He was arrested having currency and he was keeping that currency, and it was marked in certain ways that is consistent with being an MS-13 member. He was hanging out with other MS-13 members. He was identified by a consistently reliable confidential informant, according to the immigration officials. Not only that he was an MS-13 member, but what his rank, status, and nickname were. That's the kind of detail you're looking for in a confidential informant's report for its authenticity and reliability. He was, on top of that, arrested in the state of Tennessee, and the Biden FBI ordered him released, bringing in 6 or 7 other people that didn't appear to be U.S. citizens, who didn't appear to have any luggage, and other indicators that he was involved in a human trafficking operation on behalf of MS-13. And the only reason he didn't go to prison sooner and wasn't deported in a timely manner, because he's been ordered deported many years ago, is because of the Biden administration intervening to protect him. And then, of course, it turns out he's got domestic violence protection orders, and his wife reports he attacks her all the time, and so on and so forth. So the evidence overwhelmingly points to him being an MS-13 member. If he was not an MS-13 member, he could dispute that in El Salvador, because, again, he's being detained in El Salvador, not pursuant to U.S. law, but pursuant to El Salvador law. El Salvador released him temporarily to meet up with the senator from Maryland, who was calling him, like the media, a Maryland man. He was an El Salvadoran. And they released the photos showing him drinking margaritas with him, which has embarrassed.
Just to steelman that, allegedly, according to Van Hollen, someone ordered those or delivered them after the meeting took place, and they think it was
he's trying to make up all the different excuses for him doing the love affair meme with. I think Matt Walsh originally put that meme out, and then he actually lived out the meme. And credit to the El Salvadoran president, he knew exactly how to handle that. And then he returned the individual to El Salvador in custody, because the conclusion of the El Salvadoran authorities is that he is an MS-13 gang member and, as such, dangerous and a threat to the safety and security of El Salvador. At this point, he's not being detained pursuant to U.S. law. He's being detained pursuant to El Salvadoran law. And then last but not least, as President Trump highlighted, he has tattoos on his body that are consistent with what MS-13 puts on. And some people are saying, oh, well, the letters MS-13 are they're not that dumb. The goal is you communicate using various tattoos that the gang knows as being affiliated with you without saying, I'm a gang member right on the tattoo, as if that's what's necessary to prove someone's in MS-13. So there's really no meaningful question that he was subject to MS-13. There's also no meaningful question that the Trump administration had, and like, for example, they said the Trump DOJ admitted nothing. As Stephen Miller pointed out, a Biden holdover, liberal Democratic attorney was representing the Trump Justice Department and misrepresented the record in order to highlight one piece of information, namely that one immigration official many years ago, in a different set of circumstances, had said for him to be deported, but not to El Salvador. Of course, the president can override that at any time. An immigration official is a bureaucratic official that works for the government. All immigration judges are bureaucratic officials that work for the executive branch of government. They're not part of Article 3. They're not part of the judicial branch. It is all the due process that until this last decision was all that has ever been required. You want to know American law? I'm going to be doing a masterclass at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. I'll make this one freely available and shareable for people. And I'll go through about 6 or so of the most significant immigration cases in American history. And those stem from the mid-1880s through the 1950s. And they cover 2 different groups of people that raise the question of what constitutional rights are illegal immigrants or other immigrants entitled to.
The one question on my end, because the steel man is, they say the bond hearing is not a full evidentiary hearing on his status as an MS-13, as if there's some sort of declaratory judgment where you have a trial on the merits. But it is not the case that the bond hearing is ex parte or non-adversarial. It's an adversarial hearing during which time the prosecution, or whatever you want to call it, puts out their evidence, and Kilmar can put out his counter evidence. So it's not as though he wasn't present. It's not as though there was no evidentiary hearing. There was, albeit not on a trial on the merits as to his status as an MS-13 member. And after that contradictory or adversarial evidentiary hearing, the judge, the bond judge, and the appellate review determined him to be an MS-13 based on the evidence.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And the other key component with this is illegals, people that are not legally present here, have never been entitled to a trial. They've never been entitled even to a full hearing. They're not entitled to legal counsel. What people are confusing is what constitutes due process depends on the circumstances. What does that mean? The due process clause of both the Fifth Amendment that applies to the federal government and the 14th Amendment that applies to the state governments includes procedural components and substantive components. So those are when your substantive rights are being infringed upon. I've always considered that a misnomer. The better way to understand it is what process is due depends on what property or liberty interest is at stake. So what the due process clause says is you will not be deprived of your property or liberty if you're simply a person under the 14th Amendment as applied to the states. And to a degree in the Fifth Amendment as well, then you're entitled to all the process that is due depending on what property or liberty interest you have. What the Supreme Court did until this weekend had been unanimous in its determinations and its precedents, going back more than a century, was that if you are illegally here, if you've basically trespassed into the country, you have no legally recognized property interest in being here. You have no legally protected liberty interest in being here. Deportation is not seen as a punishment. Deportation is not seen as a deprivation of your property or liberty because you have no property or liberty interest to be here in the first place. If you do have legal right to be here, and there's been a deliberate confusion by the press and the legal left, pretending that in order not to remove him by an immigration official to El Salvador equals a right for him to be here. It does not. The law has been universal in all of his cases. He is not entitled to be here. He must be deported. That's what the law has consistently held.
And just to add that the reason, unless I've misunderstood, and I hope I haven't, I don't think I have, is that the reason why he was withheld from return to El Salvador was specifically because rival gang members would want to harm him. That's where his danger was, because he was an MS-13 gang member.
Yeah, in part. Now, he had this whole other story about how his family owned this small business and this particular gang was threatening the business. There was no independent corroborative evidence of that. And it was evidence he didn't introduce until after he'd been ordered deported. So, what's been happening is the legal left has weaponized the asylum law. And they've been teaching and training people to fabricate stories and falsify stories. I believe a lot of the pro immigration lawyers should be looked at by the Justice Department because I think they've been engaged in systematic and systemic subornation of perjury before federal officials because there's too much of a pattern now. People who didn't claim any asylum at all when they first got here, people who claim no asylum when they are initially picked up, don't claim asylum when they're going through the whole deportation process until they're ordered removed, suddenly coming up with asylum stories. And this happened under the Trump administration, where the Soros-sponsored, funded NGOs were out there promoting it, preaching it, teaching it. Here's how you come up with a fake story to stay in America. Here's how you come up with a fake story to get illegal access to American goods, services, employment benefits, as we are now discovering, massive benefits. Huge amounts of taxpayer dollars were being given to these people. If you're a veteran and got injured in battle, you were getting less money when you came back for your disability than were illegals being imported into the United States by the Biden administration. By which I would note the courts did absolutely nothing about. That they took very little affirmative action to prevent the systemic and systematic violation of the due process rights of the American people and American citizenry. That's whose due process rights have been systematically violated because their liberty and property interests have been put at risk by releasing a large number of criminals onto our streets, not just competitors with labor and other aspects, but also just flat out criminals. That's who Trump is targeting. The latest group the Supreme Court prevented deportation of is some of the worst rap sheets of all illegals in the world. I mean, you're talking sexual abuse, rape, rape of a minor, physical assault, systemic robbery, gang activities, you name it. I mean, these people have unbelievable rap sheets. Amazing they were inside the country at all. And here the Supreme Court is rushing to keep them into the country. So and this has arisen even in the habeas context. And there's two components of that. One, it's useful to remember the Constitution itself allows the President of the United States to suspend habeas corpus. Abraham Lincoln did it during the Civil War for kind of obvious reasons. Now, by the way, Lincoln extended it to places that it didn't belong. So, for example, Lincoln extended the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus to parts of the country that were not in the middle of a conflict. So he could dispatch certain critics and others that he didn't like. So that was a part of Lincoln's legacy. That's not the better part of his legacy. But it is useful to remember that in case of invasion, and that's what the president has already determined here under the Alien Enemies Act, that there's been an invasion, particularly of TDA gang members on behalf of a state-sponsored invasion by the Venezuelan government as payback and punishment for sanctions on Venezuela and to relieve their massive crime problem in the then upcoming election in Venezuela. They needed that radically reduced. So how did they do it? They gave basically free mechanisms and means in collusion with Soros-sponsored NGOs to flood America with some of the most dangerous gang members in the world. That's who Trump is trying to correct and fix and remedy. The Supreme Court up until this point had constantly said that even in the context of a habeas petition, that relief is very limited. That essentially that the only thing you're looking at is whether a person's in U.S. custody, is whether an executive official gave him due process. And what does that mean? Did they ask some questions? Did they do? I mean, it's real basic. They said it could be summary. They said it could be in a 2-minute hearing, right? So that gives you when you're not here legally, you have very little constitutional interest against deportation. That's what the courts have said forever. And now this happened even with people who are here legally. This happened in all the first set of cases all include the Chinese Exclusion Act cases. So from 1886 to 1915 or so, you've got a bunch, and with all kinds of eclectic sounding Chinese names, like Wing Wang and Ying Yu and all the rest. You need to pronounce Mandarin to get it right, and Mandarin's an important language to pronounce because the same word can sound totally different based on your pronunciation. Either you're saying I want some soup, or you want the kind of soup that ends up in the toilet. So all depending on how you phrase the word. But that's been the law until this past weekend, where the Supreme Court overturned and ignored over a century of legal precedents that said the executive branch completely controls the borders and foreign policy and immigration, that Congress completely controls what due process they allow. And they didn't allow the courts to be involved in this process much at all if they're illegally here in the first place. And that due process does not require anything more than a very summary executive official proceeding for that person to be removed from the country. They just ignored it all in issuing an insane injunction that wasn't even procedurally proper. I mean, what happened is after they said you have to bring individual habeas cases and you have to bring it in the jurisdiction where the person is detained, and habeas is extremely limited as to what it's required and doesn't require anything more than the court to just say, yes, he got his executive due process, that's it. What the habeas is there for the person that is truly being mistakenly removed. In other words, someone who's legally present, who, for example, say wasn't a communist, as was in some of the communist deportation cases. Because the first group, Chinese exclusion cases, second group, communist exclusion cases. Read the breadth of the law in those cases. The Supreme Court said many times said, quote, there is no place for judicial review. The Supreme Court has said this repeatedly for a century and a half. Now, all of a sudden, the worst, most dangerous gang members in the world, who are part of an invasion, according to the president, by which the president could suspend the writ of habeas for those people. He could say, I'm suspending the writ of habeas corpus as it applies to the TDA members who are part of a systemic, organized, state-sponsored invasion of our country to destabilize our society and cause massive criminal issues in our country. Right? The same Maryland senator that cared greatly for this El Salvadoran gang member said literally nothing about Maryland people who have been raped and murdered by illegals present in his state, thanks to him. And so, in fact, the mother spoke out with President Trump this week in opposition to what that senator was doing. So, what this shows is the Supreme Court is still fragile. That the Supreme Court is still ideologically aligned more with the elites than they are the American people. The American people have made crystal clear, this has been a global cry, frankly, throughout Europe. Brexit passed because of immigration. The Meloni seized power in Italy because of immigration. Orban is extraordinarily popular in Hungary because of immigration. Figo is very popular in Slovakia because of maybe it's Slovenia. I get those two confused all the time. Because of immigration. So the rise of the AfD. AfD, I think is how it's pronounced.
Alternative for Deutschland.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's right. You can speak some German. But some languages just sound brutal. I mean, German, Russians always sound like they're going to beat each other up when you listen to them talking Russian. And Germans always, you're like, now I know why the Nazis came from there.
You see people screaming in Italian. It's almost beautiful. You see people arguing in Japanese, and it's intimidating. German as well.
But yeah. My brother can speak it fluently.
Rob, the question that I had,
but I'm not one of those people.
But I accuse me of being too idealistic. Is there not a possibility that the court is saying, look, we'll make everybody happy, just pause the deportations for now, and then we're going to really lay down the blueprint and legitimize it so that no one will scream bloody murder or foul from the press?
I think, it's always speculation at this point, but it's the three justices that went AWOL were Roberts, Barrett, and Kavanaugh. Four, and Gorsuch. So now Gorsuch does have a libertarian streak. Sometimes that breaks good. Sometimes it doesn't break good. So if from a more populist perspective, so we'll see. He's always been against nationwide injunctions. So I think that's what the other procedural problems with this case was they issued this prohibition without any briefing from the government. They did so on behalf of a class action that not only hasn't occurred, because they call it a putative class, which means there is no class action. Mm-hmm. And under federal rules of civil procedure, you can't give class relief until there's been class certification. And yet the Supreme Court just did that.
But also, did they not just defy their own court order of a couple of weeks ago? Because they said putative class action is not the mechanism. Go by habeas in each individual case. And yet now they've prohibited the deportation as a putative class, which has not yet been materialized despite their prior ruling.
And that's the third problem, is that habeas is not capable of these kind of class actions. So it violates their own federal rules of civil procedure. It violates their own precedent. It violates their own policies and the policies behind these rules. So the question then becomes why and what does it mean now and what does it mean on a go-forward basis? For President Trump, this kind of confrontation was necessary. I told people the courts, along with bureaucracy, would be the principal obstacles for Trump getting through the agenda that the American people voted him to deliver upon. So one of the priorities of the American people is changing trade policy, but also trading all of foreign policy, including wars and immigration. Less war, less immigration, better trade. That was the magical trifecta for Trump in the 2024 election. And they're doing everything possible to derail that. The bureaucracy is rushing to the judicial branch, and the left is rushing to the judicial branch to get their protection from the American people. This isn't about exercising democracy. This is about crushing democracy.
Another question. What happened? I was just Googling to see, or not Googling, I was looking up the trends of asylum, because it seems that at some point in recent memory, everyone coming to the States claimed asylum. And in Google Trends, this is global, but it was the same spike on the domestic US. It was 2009, right, or just before 2010. It was Obama's second year in office. What happened in 2009? Did this become the de facto policy for the Democrats as relates to immigration back in 2009, and none of us who were not paying
it to a degree? So the idea started then, but the mass education and the mass campaigning to get buy-in from all the NGOs and then all the lawyers representing them really didn't happen until Trump. And so you started seeing it take off in 2018, 2019. One of the ways, basically what you would do is you just come to the U.S. border and say asylum, and you'd get released in the country. They called it catch and release. And because you have no other legal entitlement to be here. And the problem was almost none of these asylum cases met it. For example, the El Salvadoran man, they didn't find the evidence credible that he had an asylum claim. They just said that maybe there's a risk if he goes back to El Salvador. Now, the reason why that was no longer valid was threefold. First, the president had changed policy and said if you're an MD-13 member or TDA member, you're getting deported, period. So that overrode that prior lower official in the executive department's determination. Second, the facts changed. So the gang he was worried about no longer exists in El Salvador, right? So there was no longer any basis to withhold him from El Salvador. And then third, why wouldn't he prefer El Salvador to Gitmo? Because that's the other place Trump is sending a lot of these folks, sending them to Gitmo. So it's not necessarily in his interest, whatever his lawyers may be advocating. But basically, what they did is they made asylum a fraud. So, I objected to this all the way back, not only on your grounds we can't afford this amount of immigration to the country at this point, where the country's at in terms of its labor supply and working class conditions and communities, but also just legally that what it would do is undermine legitimate asylum claims. I say this as someone who has represented people in the asylum context. And generally, it's been getting harder and harder and harder for a legitimate asylum person to win because the left has flooded the system with fraudulent claims. And I think those lawyers should pay some consequence for those fraudulent claims.
In the context of asylum, does the threat need to come from the government, or can it come from an entity within the country?
Generally speaking, it needs to come from the government in order to be a legitimate asylum claim, right? I mean, just facing high crime is not a legitimate asylum claim. Having a poor economic market is not an asylum claim. So there are certain circumstances where if the state cannot protect you from private violence, you can make an asylum claim. But it was intended originally for people seeking asylum because they were being threatened by their government, and that's why they couldn't go back to that government. It was never meant to be a free ticket into a country. That, hey, my conditions aren't great where I live, and so now can I come here? And that's the nature of what it's become, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. Now, most the corrupted parts of the immigration administrative process went along with some of this nonsense, but most rejected it. Now, what the liberal courts have been doing and the liberal legal media has been doing is they've been repeating the lies of these folks' lawyers as if they're true. These lawyers systematically perpetrate fraud upon the courts, and they know what they're doing because it's too much of a pattern now. It's not someone who, they told me this claim. Okay, I'll present it as best I can, even if our evidence isn't great for it. The lawyers are making up the claims themselves because you're seeing people have never made these claims until the lawyer gets involved. And then all of a sudden it's, maybe you're really an asylum person. Have you thought about that? That kind of routine. So So I think the NGOs who aided and abetted mass illegal immigration under the Biden administration should be civilly investigated and criminally investigated. I think some administration officials under the Biden administration aided and abetted the illegal immigration into the country, all of which is a federal felony. I think they should be put under investigation and, if necessary, indicted. And the lawyers and the NGOs with them need to be under investigation and potentially indicted. This is the professional managerial class has used its credentialed position in law and medicine to corrupt those institutions to favor their own ideological bias. That's how you get the medical profession signing on to changing teenagers' genders based on mental confusion of a 10-year-old, or their parent. That's how you get to all the insane COVID policies. That's how and a lot of people have been commenting, where was this concern for due process of law when our rights to go to church were being taken away, when our rights to go to school were being taken away, when our rights to work were being taken away? Were we being forced to undergo medical experimentation as a condition of employment or education? When we were being forced under mass house arrest throughout the country? They were nowhere to be found. The ACLU was nowhere to be found. The ACLU is like what I grew up with them, their reputation in the South, the Anti-Christian Liberties Union, the American Commie-Loving Union. That used to be the joke about them. But now that's who they are. They only care about leftist ideas, and they only selectively promote them for leftists. Even if it's the same policy, if it's the policy, say, about bail, if it's somebody on the right, like the January 6th defendants, like Kurt Benschuf, suffering from wrongful abuse of the bail powers of the courts, ACLU, nowhere to be found. They only care about actual lefty causes and constituencies, and that's illegals and criminals. That's pretty much it now. They don't actually care about ordinary Americans or American citizens. And I think what this is pushing to is potential constitutional reform. Maybe we need to go back and amend the 14th Amendment to make clear it's all citizens who are due process of law. That's who the Constitution was meant to protect.
No, but it's so preposterous. You illegally enter the country despite you set aside your criminal status and then claim constitutional due process after having broken the law in order to procure that constitutional due process that is otherwise not bestowed on you, if only because you're illegally breaking into the country in order to steal those rights. I mean, you're basically stealing constitutional rights by illegally entering the country. It's freaking
this
wild.
Isn't the separation of powers. This is the usurpation of power by the judicial branch. This is the judicial branch saying they are supreme to the executive branch. They are supreme to the legislative branch because they're now encroaching in areas that they themselves have recognized for a century and a half were not their business. They said it was up to Congress to determine the laws of naturalization. It was up to Congress to determine the rules for deportation. And it was up to the president to execute them. And that those decisions were unreviewable in almost all instances. Outside of if someone how can you get a property interest? All right, Viva's an example. Viva does have a property and liberty interest because it's been given a visa, right? Then your rights change. Then you have much more rights than someone who's illegally present. You have a legitimate, constitutionally protected property or liberty interest. Not as much as a U.S. citizen, but much, much more than an illegal.
And by way of example, it's conceivable that once you've procured a certain visa, that when you cross the border, they accidentally enter you under let's just say a travel visa, which expires after 6 months. And then you would say, if they just kicked you out, you'd say, no, that was a mistake. I'm entitled to however long my visa is, and no due process. That's where you would talk about it, a clerical mistake, right, and the due process that is afforded to someone who procured the lawful visa in the first place.
And you have these people quoting saying, see, the Supreme Court has always said due process. Yes, what they're ignoring is what process is due. Due process does not mean the same thing. In certain instances where your property or liberty interest is substantial, due process means a high evidentiary standard. It means a full trial. It means right to counsel. It means right to cross-examine and confront your accusers. It means a right to an independent judge appointed by the Senate and the president. That's not what it means in the illegal immigration context. It means whatever Congress has said and whatever the president gave you. That's it. No more. That's all. So that's what's being ignored. And the order. So the question becomes: is the Supreme Court going to reverse a century and a half of American case law on the power of immigration in order to overturn the results of the 2024 presidential election and not allow the president to correct what Biden did, which was allow, against the law, mass invasion of this country of illegal immigrants, including the ones Trump is focused on currently, very dangerous to our society. These are convicted criminals in most instances. The injunction they just issued, the people that are just about to be deported on the TDA list, have, again, some of the worst rap sheets known to man. These are people who've been through criminal trials and been convicted. They've been afforded more process than they were ever due. And so the key becomes, what is Gorsuch, Barrett, Kavanaugh, and Roberts going to do? I'm confident that Gorsuch and Kavanaugh are going to come around because they're going to see the blowback. The blowback wasn't just in the court of public opinion broadly. It was from places that they otherwise have allies. I mean, take Bill Ackman. Bill Ackman's been a moderate Democrat his whole life. He supported Trump in 2024 because he said things are getting out of control. When you lose Ackman, Ackman's like, you can't have a society that says you can illegally import 20 million people, and then you can only deport them if you give them all 20 million trials. That's going to be too much money just in cost and expense. It's going to be impossible. He goes, you no longer have a country then. You no longer have a constitutionally run country then. Elections no longer matter because the American people made clear what they wanted executive policy to be in the election. The Supreme Court and the judges and the left don't like it. The professional managerial class doesn't. They're used to a monopoly on power. They had usurped power from America. Has not been a functioning constitutional democracy for the better part of a century, is the reality. The bureaucracy, whether you call it the administrative state or when you're looking at national security and law enforcement, you call it the deep state. That's what Peter Dale Scott called it in 1969. That was originally a leftist critique, by the way, that the right embraced because it accurately depicted and described what was taking place and predicted what would then happen. And the judicial branch takeover of like major cultural issues, they just decide to unilaterally step in and decide. We're going to decide about the issues of gay marriage. We're going to decide about abortion. We're going to decide about a whole bunch of things that they really had no business doing. Now they've stepped back from the breach on some of those, but not enough of them. But what that means is the American people had no say. We didn't have a functioning constitutional democracy. The American people could win an election or a constitutional republic. They could choose who they wanted, and what they wanted didn't get done. And often it didn't get done because of unelected bureaucrats and unelected judges being part of a professional managerial class coup of America's constitutional power. And this is the ultimate expression of that. So I think there's so much blowback. Elon Musk, a whole bunch of other people, but people even in the center and other legal minds that are kind of what I would call centrist, that may lean right, but are not like hardcore populists in the same sense I am. They were saying this doesn't make sense. This is impractical. This is unachievable. This is overturning an election. This is usurping executive power and congressional authorization. This is rewriting the rules of entire. I mean, what next? So if you're on a battlefield, do you have to give them due process before you shoot? I mean, these are impossible things to do. This would kill governments and societies. And I think enough of that message will get through to Gorsuch and Kavanaugh so that they'll join Alito and Thomas. Then the only question is Roberts or Barrett. Barrett is utterly untrustworthy and as dumb as a doorknob, so you can't trust her for anything. The question, what I've been banking on, is that Roberts would realize the political blowback is serious, severe, and substantial, and that the credibility of the courts, the power going forward of the courts, is at great danger if he doesn't rein in the courts. One of two things is going to happen. Either Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Gorsuch will get on board, reinstate what has always been legal precedent, and say the president's got carte blanche in this space, and save the judicial branch from itself. Also overturn all these other insane decisions trying to dictate policy, personnel, money, etc. Or they don't get on board, or Roberts stays AWOL with his hatred of Trump. Roberts, by the way, who so cared about due process, he denied it to President Trump in his own impeachment trial, not allowing him to out that the whistleblower was a fraud. That's who Mr. Due Process Roberts is. They don't care one rear end about due process of law. They care about protecting illegal immigration because it enriches their pals. We have a judicial branch that comes from the real oligarchy, is not the one that Bernie Sanders keeps fancifully imagining. The real oligarchy is bureaucratic and judicial usurpation of constitutional roles and authority to prevent and preclude the American people from being able to choose and direct policy through elections. That's the real threat. That's the real oligarchy. And that's who these people are. They're aligned in that direction. But if Roberts doesn't reverse the court, you're going to have a direct constitutional confrontation. because President Trump is not going to tolerate this incessantly. He will afford them the opportunity to fix this over the next 6 months. If they do not, then it'll be time for the president to say, I took the plane, I ordered it out. Courts can do what you want. That's end of story. That's where it's going. Trump will do that if he has to.
Well,
he's trying to avoid it, both to avoid the public brouhaha of it, but he's also trying to avoid it to give the court an opportunity to set a impressive precedent that could restore our constitutional balance of powers. Right now, we have an imbalance of power with the judicial branch exceeding its constitutional role. Either they're going to hem it in themselves, or President Trump's going to do it for him.
Yeah, and then they'll impeach him again. But let me bring this up. This is the summary paragraph of Alito's dissent, where he says, in sum, literally in the middle of the night, and it was literally, the court issued unprecedented and legally questionable relief without giving the lower courts a chance to rule, without hearing from the opposing party within 8 hours of receiving the application, with dubious factual support for its order, and without providing any explanation for its order. It was a one paragraph. I showed it earlier. I refused to join this court's order because we had no good reason to think that, under the circumstances, issuing an order at midnight was necessary or appropriate. Both the executive and the judiciary have an obligation to follow the law. The executives must proceed under the terms of our order in Trump versus JGG, which was the one talking about habeas being the proper remedy. And this court should follow established procedures. I don't know how much more blistering it can get in legal terms than that.
I mean, what he's saying is that what they did was lawless. And so whenever you have a cross of powers, the separation of powers means the president can continue to execute executive powers if the judicial branch is usurping his role. He doesn't have to defer to them as a practical matter. The whole point of balance of powers is that if one branch goes too far, the other branch has some power within it that the other branch can't take away. And so the power of the president, well, what are they going to do? The president controls all enforcement power. What are they going to do if he just puts them on a plane and ships them out? But whine about it? Complain about it? There's nothing they can do. So the courts have long understood that their power comes from public trust and confidence. If they lose that trust and confidence, they will lose their power. And what's amazing is Congress is considering increasing the budget for the judicial branch. There should be massive, massive cuts in the judicial branch. They have proven themselves untrustworthy and unreliable allies of constitutional liberty. Indeed, the greatest threat to constitutional liberty in America today is the federal judicial branch. And it is long overdue. They get hemmed in. Hopefully, Roberts wakes up and in self-preservation mode does so. If he doesn't, President Trump's going to have to do it for him.